Hello guys, this is Professor Ottercat here. The incident we're going to talk about today happened in Virginia, USA. This is the story of a vile and a despicable man who committed a heinous crime and for a time got away with the punishment he deserved. But in the end he signed his own death sentence because of his own stupidity and ignorance. The criminal's name is Paul Warner Powell, and the victim's name is Stacy Lynn Reed, born in August 21st, 1982, in a middle-class family in the States. She also has a younger sister named Christy Erin Reed, who's 2 years younger than her. Stacy was a good girl with excellent character and academics, and was widely praised by classmates and teachers in school. And Stacy also had a great ambition, that is, to be a soldier. She wanted to be the first female soldier to enter the SEAL Special Forces, and her dream was not just talking about it. In her first semester of high school, when she was 16, she signed up for the Reserve Officers Training Corps, ROTC, and shaved her long blonde hair into an army cut. The Powell family lived opposite the Stacy family. Paul was 4 years older than Stacy and also a childhood friend. As Stacy became more and more beautiful, Paul's feeling for her grew from friendship to admiration. But as he grew older, Paul's bad behaviors and his increasingly explicit racism made Stacy disgusted. So Stacy rejected Paul's confession and alienated him more and more, which made Paul very disappointed. But then Paul learned that Stacy already had a boyfriend and that her boyfriend was black. Paul, who discriminated against black severely, turned his sad emotions into rage and madness. So it came to January 22nd, 1999, when the tragedy happened. At noon, Stacy came home from school. Paul opened the door and entered Stacy's house after waiting outside for an hour. He carried 3 knives, a pistol, and a pair of scissors. At that time, Stacy was on the phone with her boyfriend. After seeing Paul coming in, Stacy hung up the phone and asked him what he was doing. Paul rudely asked Stacy to break up with the boyfriend and date him. Stacy flatly refused. Paul chased Stacy to her room and prepared to sexually assault her. Stacy scratched his hand angrily and began to resist. At this point, Paul began to show his murderous nature. He pinned Stacy on the bed, drew a knife and threatened that if she did not obey him, he would kill her. As Stacy softened a little, Paul began trying to take off her pants. After all, Stacy is a girl who's preparing to serve in the army and has very strong personality. She broke away from Paul's control again and started running out of the room. Just when she opened the door, Paul stabbed her chest directly into the heart. The cruel Paul twisted the handle of the knife before pulling it out, and then stabbed Stacy in the chest again. Stacy, badly injured, ran out of the room and crashed into her sister's room before falling to the floor. Paul followed up, found that Stacy was still alive, so he brutally stomped on Stacy's neck until she died. Paul left Stacy's body on the floor and went downstairs for a smoke and some iced tea as he waited for Stacy's sister, Christy, to come home. Christy, age 14, returned home at 3 p.m., about 2 hours after Stacy's death. Just when she was about to get the keys to open the door, Paul opened the door for her from the inside. And she was not surprised to see Paul in her house because Paul and her sister were friends and he would occasionally come to visit. Christy asked where is her sister, and Paul casually tells her that Stacy is in her room. So Christy directly went upstairs, but the room was empty. She was a little confused. When she opened the door of her room, she was stunned by what she saw. Stacy died tragically on the floor with 2 horrific knife wounds on her chest. Christy dropped the books in her hands and began to cry. Paul appeared behind Christy like a ghost, holding the sharp knife that killed Stacy in his hand. While threatening Christy with the knife, he yelled at her to go downstairs to the basement. Once in the basement, Paul made her undress and lie on the floor, then raped Christy. Just after he succeeded, there was a knock on the front door. Paul felt guilty and thought it was the police. He cut Christy's shoelaces and then tied her hands and feet, and threatened her to kill her if she cried for help. In fact, it was Christy's friend, Mark, who knocked on the door. Christy invited Mark to play at home when school was over. Mark knocked on the door a few times and saw no one answered and left. This decision saved his life because at that time Paul was on the other side of the door, pistol and knife in hand. Just as Paul was guarding the door, Christy managed to loosen the shoelaces binding her hands and tried to hide under the stairs, but Paul went back to the basement before she could hide from him. He knew that Christy was the only witness who could prove that he was the murderer of Stacy, so he decided to kill Christy. He wrapped shoelaces around Christy's neck and strangled her unconscious. Then he pulled out the knife that killed Stacy, stabbed Christy twice in the stomach and then Christy's throat. He left Christy in the basement, ready to let her bleed to death. Then he went upstairs, washed his hands, drank some iced tea, and left. About an hour later, around 4:10 p.m., 10 minutes past 4 p.m., the father of the two girls, Robert, arrived home unaware of the tragedy when he walked in the door. He began to call out the names of his daughters, but no one answered him. But his call woke up Christy, who had passed out. Although she was seriously injured, she was still awake. She wanted to call for help, but her throat was cut open. She couldn't make a sound. Robert went upstairs and found Stacy's body. Shocked, he quickly called the police. While talking with the police, he heard the noise of Christy twisting her body and bumping into objects in the basement. He ran downstairs and found Christy in the basement, naked, tied up and covered in blood. A lot of blood was still flowing out from the wound on her stomach and neck. Robert quickly took first aid measures. A police officer who came to the scene before Christy was taken to the hospital by helicopter, leaning over and asked Christy, who did it? Christy couldn't speak, but she lip-synced Paul Powell. Christy's luck was very good. The knife wound on the stomach was only 1 centimeter away from the aorta, and the knife wound on the neck was just half a centimeter away from cutting the carotid artery, so it did not cause enough bleeding in a short time to kill. But even so, the doctors fought in the operating room for 5 hours before saving Christy's life, and the wound on her neck was sutured with 60 stitches, leaving a permanent scar on the neck of this young girl. The mind also creates a permanent shadow of PTSD. Paul was arrested the next day, thinking Christy was dead, so he admitted to murdering Stacy and raped and murdered Christy, but he never confessed to his crimes. He said Stacy's death was because of his stupidity and Christy was a witness, so Christy should die. Paul was charged by the prosecution with attempted murder, rape and kidnapping. He was pleaded not guilty. Stacy's body was buried a week after the brutal crime. Because she had joined the ROTC during her lifetime, her funeral was carried with the highest standard of military funeral. The dead has gone, so the remaining thing is how to punish the murderer. It can be said that Paul's character is quite despicable and distorted. While in custody awaiting trial, he not only bragged about raping a virgin with his inmates, but also sent mocking and provocative letters to the family and friends of Stacy. In the letters, he mocked Stacy for being a black-loving jerk and threatened to kill Christy if she testified against him. He even once sent a letter to Stacy's mother with a nude photo of an actress ripped from a porn magazine. The face of the actress had some resemblance to Stacy. Paul wrote, "Ma'am, who I think resembles someone we both know, but I can't remember her name. If you can't remember, you can ask Stacy." Paul is just a freak deep down, a sadist who takes pleasure in torturing people. Finally, in 2000, the trial began. The evidence against Paul was very strong. The blood of Stacy and Christy was found on the knife found on him, and the DNA left on Christy's clothes was consistent with his. Christy also testified against him in court, and some of his inmates also testified about the things he said in prison. So on 5th of May 2000, more than 1 year after the crime, the jury found Paul guilty of aggravated murder and recommended that he should be sentenced to death. On 15th of September 2000, a Virginia judge sentenced Paul to death and fined him $200,000 in compensation to Stacy's family. He was sent to death row awaiting execution. Facts have proved that there was a reason why Paul was so arrogant in the previous trial. He found a loophole in the prosecution and began to appeal. In 2001, he really succeeded in the appeal and overturned the previous death sentence. So, what exactly is the loophole? It turned out that Virginia's criminal law is different from other states in the United States. There is one crime that can be punished with death sentence, one and only crime: vicious murder. In other words, the murderer only killed one or a few people, which can only be regarded as ordinary murder and cannot be sentenced to death. So what can be identified as vicious murder? No more than three. The first is the murder of a child under the age of 14 by an adult over the age of 21. Second is murder during rape or attempt rape. And third is the murder of a police officer. Previously, the prosecution pointed out that Paul had attempted to rape Stacy before killing her, so it was vicious murder. That's why Paul got the death penalty, but unfortunately there was no physical evidence to strongly prove that Paul tried to rape Stacy before killing her, and the cunning Paul only admitted that he killed Stacy and did not mention that he had tried to sexually assault her. Paul seized on this appeal, claiming this conviction and sentencing were improper by the trial court. In June 2001, the Supreme Court accepted Paul's argument and found that although Paul raped Christy after killing Stacy, this should be regarded as two independent cases and could not be used as a factor to aggravate the sentence. Okay, what the hell? What the hell was that? Anyway, the death sentence of Paul was revoked. He saved his life and only needed to be imprisoned for life. He seemed to have escaped the sanction he deserved. Paul, who won the appeal, became more and more ignorant. Moreover, it can be seen from the above that Paul has a certain amount of legal knowledge, and he also knows that the American judiciary that has the principle of non bis in idem, meaning not twice in the same. That is to say, as long as the jury finds that you are innocent in a case and releases you, even if you publicly admit in the media that you killed the person, the judiciary can no longer prosecute you. Knowing this, Paul felt that he had firmly grasped the life-saving talisman in his hand. So he decided to write a letter, just to disgust the prosecutors as he had disgusted Stacy's family before. Because the letter is very long and is full of obscene and profane words, I will not read it out. I'll just say a general meaning, which is to tease and ridicule the prosecutor's incompetence and stupidity. If the death penalty is decided, it will be futile for the prosecution to do anything, and he doesn't mind telling the prosecutor what really happened that day. So he vividly wrote about how he tried to rape Stacy and brutally killed her that day. Finally, he ignorantly asked the prosecutor, "Do you want to die now because of your own incompetence?" Do you think the prosecutors would be angry when they received this letter? Impossible. Their hearts are full of joy. Because Paul, this ignorant, cunning, stupid person, completely misunderstood the scope of the application of non bis in idem, which can only be received by those who have been found not guilty by a jury. And in his case, the sentence was just overruled by the Supreme Court judge. The prosecution can file a protest and request a new trial after having important evidence. And the letter he wrote to the prosecution was the key evidence that the prosecution has been distressed before. In January 2003, the prosecution successfully protested and the retrial began. This time, Paul also realized that he had dug a deep hole for himself and he might be really doomed. In court, he changed his attitude of laughing and yelling at the first trial and wept loudly in the court several times to express his repentance. He sat quietly in other times, but his letter to the prosecution and earlier letters to Stacy's family became his summons to death. The letters proved not only that he was a genuine and vicious murderer, but also that he had no remorse. He is an arrogant sadist, a rapist pedophile, a racist pedophile. In the end, the jury unanimously found him guilty after only 90 minutes of discussion and recommended that the judge consider the death penalty. May 2003, the judge heard the jury's recommendation and sentenced Paul Powell death penalty. After getting his sentence, Paul did what he should have done the last time: silence. In order to ridicule his stupidity, the Darwin Awards also gave him an honorary title, the Last Laugh. If you don't know the meaning of this award, it basically recognizes individuals who have supposedly contributed to human evolution by selecting themselves out of the gene pool by dying or becoming sterilized via their own actions. Paul kept appealing on death row, and after 7 years of tossing, he finally ushered in his final punishment on 18th of March 2010, electric chair. According to the execution records of that day, when Paul walked into the execution room and saw the electric chair, he opened his eyes wide in fear and swallowed hard. His hair and the hair on his right leg were shaved, and the trousers on his right leg were cut off from above the knee. 6 guards pinned him to the electric chair and secured him with 8 straps. A metal clip with a wet sponge and electrodes was attached to his right ankle. A metal hat with electrodes was fixed on his head. At this time, he was already sweating profusely from fear. At 8:58 p.m., the executioner read his death warrant and asked if he had any last words. He couldn't say a word and just looked towards the witness seat. There, Christy, who was brutally injured by him, had survived the catastrophe, and Christy's mother looking at him with indifferent eyes. The guard covered his face with a leather mask so that his distorted expression would not scare everyone. At 9 p.m., the executioner pressed the power button, and an 1,800-volt electric current passed through Paul's body for 30 seconds. He twisted violently on the electric chair and clenched his hands convulsively. The stench of burning began to permeate. And after 30 seconds, the electric current stopped briefly, and Paul fell heavily back on the chair without moving. After a brief stop for a few seconds, the executioner energized the 240-volt current again through Paul's body for 60 seconds. After a pause of 5 seconds, another 1,800-volt electric current began to burn Paul's body and nerves. He once again twitched violently in the chair. The sparks and smoke appeared from his leg and under the mask of his face. Large blisters began to bulge on his body, and his skin turned a purple-red color like a pig's liver. After 30 seconds, the voltage switched back to 480 volts and continued to charge him for 60 seconds. At 9:03 p.m., the execution was over. Paul's body seemed to have been fried deeply, lifeless and fixed on the chair, motionless. After waiting another 5 minutes as his body cooled down a bit, the medical examiner entered the room and used a stethoscope to confirm that he had no heartbeat. The medical examiner pronounced Paul died at 9:09 p.m. The sword in Lady Justice's hand finally chopped off. Afterwards, a reporter interviewed the mothers of the 2 girls. She said something like this: "Before this incident, I was against the death penalty, because at that time I didn't understand why must these criminals be killed to punish their crimes. But when this tragedy happened to my family, I fully understand the need for the death penalty. I am all for the death penalty right now because although the damage is irreparable, it is somewhat a relief and a comfort to our family to know that this scum is gone from the world, and we finally feel like we can start a new chapter of life." Great, that's all for today. If you like my channel, please accent the like button, follow my Instagram account, subscribe, and turn on my notification bell. And I'll see your beautiful face next time. Bye!